The subject today is population, and particularly human population will become very, very evident. But you've got to remember that the context we're dealing with is a biblical context. We make no apologies for that. The Bible is emphatic that man was created. And when you read in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, where God said he made man in his image, and the first instruction was to multiply and fill the earth and to have dominion. Now, we live in a world where all those signs portray evolution and tell you to keep out, preserve this land so you can allow evolution. Now, the Bible says God gave the planet into our hands, and he also told us to multiply and fill the earth. So there's all sorts of questions that come up, and Diane and I will discuss them a bit later. Could we have ever filled the earth? What would happen if we were here for millions of years and overpopulated the planet? Because we live in Australia. And come on, Craig, answer this one last question, I guess, if we can have you back up on screen. As you've travelled all through the outback of Australia, how many overcrowded towns did you come across?
Yeah, very few.
That's right. I have one friend who lives out at Burke, and he runs his entire farm with robot tractors. They set up laser panels at either end of the thousands of acres and set the tractor on remote. The guy sits in there just in case anything goes wrong and listens to music on his Wi-Fi system. But the tractor runs itself because the land is so flat and so vast. It is no problem, and he doesn't come across any people, and he's not in trouble of running over any tourists at all. So Australia is largely empty. So we can vouch for the fact that despite all these evolutionary signs, A, nothing is evolving, and B, we could go on for thousands and thousands of years before we even reach crowd point. But of course, we do have a housing problem, and the housing problem is due to the fact that the government brings people in, doesn't allow for where they're going to live, and we are overcrowding the cities. Get that right? We are overcrowding the cities because most people don't want to move out and live in the country, particularly those people from already overcrowded places where they've got a background of living communally in India or Arabia or places like that. Okay, I've listed this first section as 7 billion problems with an old Earth, because you and I will have noticed from those signs and from any regular watching, it is a very common view that we've had millions, if not billions of years for microbes and eventually people to overcrowd everywhere. All right, now why this topic? It's because when I was a student at university and doing genetics as well as on top of geology, we had a professor who was puzzled by a particular problem. And it was this graph. Okay, notice the 10,000 BC, notice the 2000, notice the AD, where Jesus Christ appears on the planet, then AD 1000, AD 2000. And of course, the professor was telling us that we were on the edge of not far away from overcrowding the planet. But you'll have a look at the rest of the graph, because the population increase doesn't seem to be started much until about 4000 BC at the most on his graph. Now, let's explain this. He was emphatic that we had to learn that equation. Now, I'll be honest, I've forgotten even how to do some of these sort of equations, but I got distinctions in genetics, so I did know how to do it once. P is population alive today, roughly 7 billion. C is half the number of children per family. X is generations alive today. And those of you who know mathematicians who ponder about all these things, they actually mess around until they find equations that work and describe. So that equation there really is a short version of what we've discovered about how populations work. And N is the total number of generations. Now, you'll see at the bottom I've got my source, Ian Taylor, In the Minds of Men. He's actually got his whole book, the Minds of Men, that he brought out as the first really historic book on creationism. It's filed on our website. Go look for it. Ian was a great guy. He's gone to be with the Lord now, but he had a different approach to the whole creation evolution area that dealt with history. What happens to populations? Well, here's how it works. When you have what's called ZPG, each parent has only one child to replace it. So 2 parents become 2 parents, become 2 parents, become 2 parents, become 2 parents. And the end result is no real growth in population. A family of 2 stays 2. Assuming nobody dies, of course, because that's fatal to ZPG. But ZPG is what many people are aiming for at the moment. They want the population reduced, and you get all your conspiracy theories involving diseases and use of immunizations and all of that to reduce the population, or war. War is a convenient way, according to many of these people, for keeping the population low. Now, on the other hand, history tells us that if you start with 2 people and they have 4 children, and those 4 children have 2 children each, then sooner or later you end up with what's called exponential growth. Because the 2 people who started this, well, take me, my example, my wife and I, we have a total of 18 descendants. Her mother had a total of about 25 descendants. The population has increased. So when you look at this graph that our professor brought our attention to, 4000 BC, by the time you get up to 2075, according to the graph when he was presenting it, there was roughly 9.2 billion people. Now, I suspect there may be going to be more than that, but in 2000 AD, there was 6.1 billion people, and we lived through that, and all of the kerfuffle that was going with the change into the new millennium, etc. You'll see I've listed the Black Death as areas where the population dropped. Now, why am I telling you this? These graphs are interesting because that formula I gave you, according to the professor, it works regardless of the number of wars, regardless of the number of abortions, regardless of number of murders, etc. Now, here was his puzzle. You see, he was an evolutionist, and he was openly admitting as an expert on genetics that he didn't have a clue genetically how evolution could occur. He knew how population could decrease by death and things like that, and Di and I will talk about that a bit later. But what puzzled him was if we've been here for 7 billion years, if humans have been on the planet for 3 million years, then how come we had ZPG right up to about 4,000 years ago? Because that is the history of the planet. He couldn't figure that out. Well, I'll tell you what, the Bible's got a better suggestion, particularly in our opinion, that the world's population restarted from 8 people on a big boat, largely 3 reproducing couples, Noah's 3 sons and their wives. No evidence Noah ever had any kids after the flood. But then again, he was already nearly 600 years old. So who wants kids when you're 600 years old? If we started 4,500 years ago from 3 families, which had 2.5 children only, and life expectancy was only 43, then according to Ian Taylor and all the mathematicians I've talked to, that's an accurate representation. Around 7 billion people would be the result from 3 families. Now, the reality is there are roughly 7 billion people when this graph was first put down. So the calculations based on the Bible picture are accurate. 3 families at the time of Noah's flood, and 7 billion people at the time the calculation was finally put together. And there is the problem. I mean, this is the problem that the professor listed as an evolutionist, as someone who obviously knew what the Bible had to say because he'd been raised in the old-fashioned Oxford-Cambridge tradition where there was a Christian framework to thinking, but it was abandoned because of evolution. If man began to multiply 3 million years ago, 2 hairy ape-like creatures crawled out of the trees in Africa, began to stand upright and have multiplying children, more than 2 at a time, so there was not ZPG. How come we end up with ZPG for most of the history of mankind? Now, that's the background to the introduction on population statistics. My comment, what you find is that mankind's population on the planet at the moment far better fits the biblical framework of time, far better fits the biblical history of a population drop at the time of Noah's flood. How many people were on the planet at that time is a good question. God offered them all room on Noah's Ark, so I suspect there wasn't a huge number, but only 3 families, 3 reproducing families survived.